I had always loved being out in the woods, away from the noise of the city. There was something about the quiet hum of nature that made me feel at ease. But I learned that nature, no matter how peaceful it seemed, could turn on you in an instant. A couple of years ago, I went on a solo camping trip deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I had taken plenty of trips before, but this time I wanted to test myself. I planned to hike miles off trail and camp in a remote area where I wouldn't see another soul for days. It was the kind of trip that required careful planning, extra food, a satellite phone, and gear for any situation. I parked my truck at a small gravel lot near the edge of the national forest and set out with my pack. The first day was uneventful, just hours of hiking through dense trees, following a series of ridges to get further from the well-worn trails. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, fresh water nearby, and plenty of space for a fire. After setting up my tent, I gathered some wood and got a fire going. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped quickly. I cooked a simple meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the distant sound of an owl. It felt good to be completely alone out there. The first night was peaceful, but I woke up just before dawn to the sound of something moving near my tent. At first, I thought it was just a deer, but then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps 2 feet, not 4. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Whoever it was, they weren't using a flashlight. That was the part that made me uneasy. If it was just another hiker, they would have had a light. And what were the chances of another person being way out here in the middle of nowhere? After a few minutes, the footsteps faded into the woods. I stayed in my tent, heart pounding, until the sun came up. When I finally stepped outside, there was no sign of anyone. No footprints, nothing disturbed. I told myself I had imagined it, that it was probably just a large animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I pushed on, hiking deeper into the mountains. The further I got, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the forest seemed different. It wasn't anything obvious, just a strange stillness, like the woods were holding their breath. I tried to ignore it and kept moving, following an old logging road that had long since been swallowed by the forest. That night, I set up camp on a narrow ridge. The spot gave me a good view of the valley below, but it also meant I was exposed. I built a small fire and sat with my back to a tree, scanning the darkness for any movement. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild. I had camped alone plenty of times before without feeling like this. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound that made my skin crawl. A whistle, high-pitched, sharp, and close. Not the sound of wind or an animal, this was deliberate. I held my breath, listening. Came again, from the trees below me, then another farther to the left. There were at least 2 sources. I stayed completely still, heart hammering in my chest. I knew without a doubt that someone was out there. I reached for the knife I kept in my sleeping bag and gripped it tight. The whistling stopped. The forest was completely silent again. I barely slept the rest of the night, every nerve in my body on edge. As soon as the sky turned gray with morning light, I packed up and started moving. I wasn't going to stick around to find out who or what had been out there. I pushed hard that day, covering miles of rough terrain. I wasn't following a trail anymore, just moving in what I hoped was the right direction back toward my truck. By the time the sun was low in the sky, my legs burned with exhaustion. I found a small clearing and forced myself to set up camp. I was too tired to keep going. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to be seen. I ate a cold meal, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and tried to rest. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, set me on edge. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, just outside my tent. I gripped my knife and held my breath. The footsteps circled my tent, pausing near my head. I could hear breathing slow and steady. My fingers tightened around the handle of my knife. I wanted to scream, to charge out of the tent, but I forced myself to stay still. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. I lay there, heart pounding, waiting for them to return. But they didn't. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle in my body tense. When the first light crept through the trees, I crawled out of my tent and scanned the area. The ground was covered in dry leaves, but there were no footprints. Nothing disturbed, but I knew what I had heard. I didn't waste any time packing up. I moved fast, barely stopping to eat or drink. By mid-afternoon, I finally recognized the ridge that led back toward the parking area. Relief flooded through me. I was almost there. Then I saw it, a figure standing at the tree line ahead of me, too far to make out any details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move, neither did they. I gripped my knife and took a slow step back. The figure didn't react, just stood there still as a statue. Then, without a sound, they turned and disappeared into the trees. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, heart pounding. I didn't stop until I saw the glint of my truck through the trees. I scrambled inside, locked the doors, and peeled out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I don't know who or what I encountered out there. I never reported it. What would I have said? That someone whistled in the woods? That I saw a shadowy figure watching me? No one would have believed me. I still go camping, but never alone, and never that deep in the woods, because now I know. I'm not the only one who likes to be out there, far from civilization. And some things, some people don't want to be found. I should have known better than to pick a campsite that close to the tree line. The clearing itself wasn't small, but it wasn't wide open either. Maybe 30 yards across, surrounded on all sides by thick pine forest. It had taken me nearly 2 hours to get here, hiking deep into the backcountry, far away from any official trails. I liked solitude when I camped. I didn't want to hear people talking in the distance or see the glow of other campfires. But sometimes, solitude isn't a comfort. Sometimes it turns against you. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, about 10 feet from the nearest trees. I figured that would give me enough shelter from the wind, but still keep me far enough from the woods that nothing could sneak up on me without making a sound. After getting the tent up, I gathered wood and built a fire. The sun had already started dipping behind the mountains, and the air was cooling fast. I had packed light, just a small backpack, a sleeping bag, a tarp, and a few meals that didn't need much preparation. This wasn't my first time solo camping, and I knew how to manage with the basics. As night set in, I sat by the fire, eating my food and listening to the sounds of the forest. In the distance, I heard the occasional crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. Normal nighttime noises. I wasn't worried, but something about the way the firelight flickered at the edge of the clearing made me uneasy. Shadows stretched and shrank against the trees, and at one point, I thought I saw movement just beyond the fire's reach. I told myself it was my imagination and forced myself to stay calm. The fire burned down to glowing embers, and I decided to turn in for the night. I made sure everything was secured, double-checked my backpack, and crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I pulled the bag tight around me. The sounds of the forest continued, but they felt different now. More distant, like the trees themselves were holding their breath. I listened for a long time, waiting for sleep to come, but my mind wouldn't quiet down. Something felt off. Then I heard it. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind moving through the trees. A soft, deliberate sound. Footsteps. Slow, measured steps moving just beyond my tent. I held my breath and strained to listen. The steps stopped. The forest was completely silent. I stayed as still as possible, my heart pounding in my chest. Maybe it was an animal, I thought, a deer or something else wandering through the woods. But something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It hadn't been a four-legged shuffle. It had been the sound of a foot pressing into the dirt, pausing, then lifting again. I reached for the knife I always kept by my sleeping bag, gripping the handle tight. Minutes passed. Nothing. Slowly, I let my muscles relax, telling myself it had been my imagination. Maybe I had just misheard something. Maybe the wind had shifted, causing a tree branch to scrape against another. Then, just as I started to convince myself, the steps came again. Closer this time. I held my breath. My grip on the knife tightened. The steps moved, circling my tent. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was testing the boundary of my camp. The fire outside had burned down almost completely, leaving only faint, smoldering embers. Whoever or whatever was out there was staying just beyond where the light had reached. Then the sound stopped. Silence stretched out for what felt like forever. I strained my ears, listening for the slightest movement. Nothing, not even the usual nighttime sounds. The forest was completely still. Then I heard breathing. Low, steady breathing, just outside my tent. My fingers clenched around the knife. I forced myself to stay completely still, barely even daring to exhale. The breathing was slow, measured. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded human. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, waiting for whatever was outside to make a move. My mind raced through my options. I had no gun, just the knife. Running blindly into the woods would be a mistake. Staying inside the tent felt like waiting to be trapped. Then, without warning, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I stayed frozen, waiting, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. After what felt like an hour, I slowly, carefully, reached for the zipper of my tent. I moved as silently as possible, my fingers trembling slightly. I didn't want to make noise, but I needed to see if anything was out there. I unzipped just enough to peek out. The fire had nearly gone out, but in the faint glow of the embers, I saw footprints in the dirt. They were fresh, circling my tent. Human footprints. My blood went cold. Whoever had been outside had walked around my tent more than once. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up, gripping my knife, eyes locked on the tent's entrance. The silence stretched on, but I knew something or someone was out there, waiting. As soon as the first hint of dawn broke through the trees, I packed my gear faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't bother eating. I just threw everything into my backpack and started hiking. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. Even in the daylight, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every snap of a branch, every rustling leaf sent my pulse racing. I walked fast, almost jogging, pushing through exhaustion. It wasn't until I reached my car hours later that I finally let myself breathe. I never reported it. What would I even say? That I heard breathing? That I saw footprints? No crime had been committed. No evidence beyond what I had seen with my own eyes. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that someone was out there, watching me, waiting in the dark. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. And I don't think I ever will. The air was thick with humidity as I tightened the straps of my backpack, adjusting the weight evenly across my shoulders. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A solo camping trip deep in the wilderness, far from the hum of civilization. I wanted the solitude, the challenge, the experience of being truly alone in the woods. The hike in had been long, much longer than I had anticipated. I started on a well-maintained trail, but the further I went, the thinner and rougher it became. Soon, I was navigating dense underbrush and climbing over fallen logs. It was mid-afternoon when I finally reached a small clearing by a slow-moving stream. The ground was soft, a mix of dirt and pine needles, and there were no obvious signs of animal activity nearby. It seemed like a good enough spot to set up camp. I dropped my pack and stretched my arms, feeling the ache of miles walked. After setting up my tent, I gathered firewood, making sure to get a good mix of dry kindling and thicker logs. I had brought enough food to last me a few days, but I planned to supplement it by fishing in the stream and foraging where I could. The sky darkened as the sun dipped behind the trees, and I started my fire, the warm glow pushing back the creeping night. Sitting by the fire, I felt at peace. The only sounds were the crackling flames, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl. This was exactly what I had wanted. Time to disconnect, to be alone with my thoughts, to be surrounded by nature with no distractions. It was around midnight when I decided to call it a night. I banked the fire, making sure it wouldn't go out completely but wouldn't spread either. The air had cooled considerably, and as I crawled into my sleeping bag, I felt exhaustion wash over me. I must have been asleep for only a couple of hours when I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. My heart was pounding in my chest, but everything seemed quiet. I listened, straining my ears, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual nighttime sounds, the wind shifting through the trees, the distant trickling of the stream. I took a deep breath and told myself I was being paranoid. It was easy to spook yourself when you were alone in the woods. Then I heard it, a single, deliberate footstep, not the soft, unpredictable shuffle of an animal. This was different. It was heavy, slow, stopped just outside my tent. I froze, barely breathing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I had just heard. A deer? A bear? But bears usually made more noise, and deer moved more lightly. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, listening for any further movement. Nothing. Minutes passed, and slowly, I allowed myself to breathe again. Maybe it had been my imagination, some trick of my half-asleep mind. I closed my eyes, willing myself to relax. Then, another step. My blood ran cold. It was closer this time. My hands clenched the sleeping bag as I debated my options. My knife was within reach, but what good would that do if I was dealing with something bigger than me? My only real defense was my fire, still smoldering outside. If I made a sudden move, whatever was out there might react badly. But staying in the tent felt worse. It felt like waiting. Slowly, carefully, I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The inside of the tent lit up, but the canvas walls blocked my view of anything outside. I took a breath, counted to 3, and unzipped the tent in one quick motion. The beam of my flashlight swept across the clearing. The fire was still glowing faintly, casting flickering shadows. The trees stood tall and unmoving. Nothing looked out of place, but something had been there. I knew it. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the fire, gripping my knife. Whatever had been outside my tent didn't return, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I decided I had had enough. I packed up my gear, doused the fire, and started back the way I had come. The hike back felt longer, my nerves on edge the entire way. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following me, but I never saw anything. It wasn't until I reached my car that I allowed myself to breathe a full sigh of relief. I tossed my pack in the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors immediately. As I sat there, gripping the steering wheel, I looked back at the dense tree line one last time. I still don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, or maybe I really wasn't alone in those woods. But one thing is certain, I won't be going back to find out. I always liked camping alone. There was something about the silence, the space, and the feeling of being away from people that made me feel at peace. I never thought much about the dangers, even when I probably should have. But this trip changed that. I had driven up into the mountains, far from any towns, deep into national forest land where few people ever went. It was the kind of place where you could go all weekend without seeing another person. That was what I wanted. I picked a spot about 10 miles down a narrow dirt road that twisted up into the hills. The trees were thick, mostly pine and fir, with patches of aspen scattered here and there. A small creek ran nearby, and there was a clearing big enough for my tent and a fire. It was perfect. I spent the first part of the evening setting up camp. I pitched my tent close to the tree line, giving myself some cover from the wind, but still leaving an open view of the clearing. I built a small fire pit and gathered wood while I still had daylight. The sun dropped fast behind the mountains, and soon, the woods were filled with the usual nighttime sounds: crickets, the occasional rustling in the brush, the distant call of an owl. It was comforting in a way. I ate my dinner by the fire, A simple meal of canned chili and some bread. The stars came out bright in the sky, and the night air was cool but not too cold. Felt good. I had no plans other than to relax. Maybe hike a little the next day before heading back home. I put out the fire and crawled into my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know what had woken me. The fire was out and the tent was pitch black inside. I listened, hearing nothing but the wind moving through the trees. Then something shifted outside. A soft, steady sound. Footsteps. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. It wasn't an animal. I had been camping enough times to know the difference between the light steps of a deer or the padding of a coyote. This was different. Slow, deliberate. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I reached slowly for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. My fingers closed around it, but I didn't turn it on yet. I waited, listening. The steps moved closer, then stopped. Silence. I could feel my own pulse hammering against my ribs. I didn't want to make any sudden movements, but I knew I had to see what was out there. I flicked on the flashlight and pointed it at the tent wall. Nothing. The light shone through the thin fabric, casting a faint glow. I turned it off again, hoping my eyes would adjust to the dark. Then I heard it just outside the tent, maybe 2 feet away. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. A cold wave of fear ran through me. I had my knife in my pack, but it was out of reach. I stayed frozen, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. The footsteps moved again, this time away from the tent. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, gripping the flashlight, listening for any sound. Eventually, the first light of dawn broke over the trees, and I dared to unzip the tent. The clearing was empty. Nothing looked disturbed. My gear was still where I had left it. But as I stepped outside, my foot hit something in the dirt. I looked down and felt my stomach drop. A single boot print. Not mine. I packed up fast. I didn't bother eating. I didn't even try to enjoy the morning air. I shoved everything into my backpack and threw dirt over the fire pit. Then, I hiked back to my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. The drive back down the dirt road felt endless. I kept expecting to see something in my rearview mirror. I didn't relax until I was back on the main highway, miles away from those woods. I still go camping, but I never go alone anymore. I stick to places where other people are nearby, even if I don't talk to them. I don't take chances, because out there, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but trees and silence around you, you're not always as alone as you think. I went on a solo camping trip deep in the forests of northern Montana, something I'd done a handful of times before. I liked the quiet. I liked the solitude. My job kept me in front of a computer all week, and I needed the contrast, the stillness of the woods, the sounds of nature, the lack of anything artificial humming in the background. I chose a spot off a dirt road, miles from anything, an area I'd been to once before with a couple of friends. It was remote, thick with trees, the kind of place where you felt like the only person left in the world. I parked my truck a little off the road, grabbed my pack, and hiked in about a mile to where I wanted to set up camp. It was late afternoon, and the sky was clear. The weather was perfect, warm enough that I didn't need to layer up yet, but cool enough that hiking with a full pack wasn't miserable. I found a clearing near a creek, flat and open, but with enough tree cover to give me some shelter. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got everything in order before the sun started to dip. Felt good to be out there, away from everything. I made a quick dinner, ate as the sun set, and let the fire die down to embers as I sat in the silence, listening to the forest. By the time I crawled into my tent, it was completely dark. The air had cooled, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the trickling of the creek nearby. I zipped up my sleeping bag, adjusted my headlamp within reach, and lay there for a while, staring at the fabric of the tent above me, feeling myself relax in a way I only ever did out in the woods. I don't know how long I was asleep before I woke up. I didn't sit up or panic, but I felt that sudden shift from sleep to wakefulness, the kind where something had changed. Something had pulled me out of sleep. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, listening. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not a deer, not the scurrying of a small animal, but slow, deliberate steps. Human steps. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The sound was coming from somewhere off to my right, moving through the trees. My mind raced through possibilities. Another camper? A hunter? Someone lost? But there was no reason for anyone to be out here. This wasn't a marked campsite. There were no trails nearby. I was miles from the nearest road, and even that was just a dirt path. I listened as the footsteps moved closer. Not fast, not hurried, just slow and steady, like whoever it was knew exactly where they were going. My heart pounded in my ears. Then they stopped. I strained to hear, holding my breath. Nothing. Just the sound of the creek and the occasional rustle of leaves. I waited. Minutes passed. Maybe more. The forest was still. I told myself it had been an animal. A deer passing through. I closed my eyes, willing myself to sleep, but every time I started to drift, I thought I heard something. A snap of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. At some point, exhaustion won. I fell asleep. I woke up with the first light of dawn. The inside of my tent was cold, and my body was stiff. The night felt distant, like something I'd imagined in a half-sleep haze. I unzipped the tent and crawled out, stretching my legs. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the tree-line to my tent, stopping just a few feet away. My stomach dropped. They were clear, deep impressions in the damp earth. Bare feet, not boots, not shoes. Someone had walked up to my tent in the middle of the night, and then they had stood there, watching. I looked around, heart pounding. The forest was quiet. The air was cool. I packed up my camp faster than I ever had before, throwing everything into my pack with shaking hands. I didn't eat. I didn't even fully roll up my sleeping bag. I just stuffed it into my pack and started moving. I didn't run, but I walked fast, keeping my knife in one hand, my bear spray in the other. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder. By the time I reached my truck, I was sweating despite the cool air. I tossed my pack into the bed, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, my heart still hammering. Then I turned the key, threw the truck into drive, and didn't look back. I don't know who it was. I don't know what they wanted, but I never went back to that spot again. I had always loved being out in the woods. The feeling of being away from the noise, the crowded streets, and the artificial glow of city lights was something I looked forward to whenever I could get time off work. I wasn't an expert survivalist or anything, but I knew my way around a campsite, and I enjoyed the simplicity of it. Packing light, setting up a fire, cooking meals over an open flame, and sleeping under the stars. There was a peace to it that was hard to find anywhere else. But peace is the last word I'd use to describe what happened on my last trip. It was late summer, and I had decided to head out to a remote area in the national forest, about 50 miles from the nearest town. I had been there a couple of times before and knew the terrain well enough to feel comfortable going alone. The spot I picked was near a small creek, deep enough in the woods that I wouldn't have to worry about running into too many other campers. I preferred it that way. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent near a clearing with a good view of the sky, gathered firewood, and spent the afternoon fishing in the creek. The air was warm, the water was cool, and everything felt exactly how I wanted it to feel. That night, I cooked up the trout I had caught, ate by the fire, and listened to the sounds of the forest until I got tired enough to crawl into my sleeping bag. The first thing that woke me up was the wind. It had picked up in the middle of the night, rustling the trees, making the tent fabric flap loud enough to pull me out of sleep. I glanced at my watch, 2:13 a.m. I wasn't worried. I had camped in strong winds before, and my tent was well secured. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable again. Then I heard something else. A sound that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. A snapping noise, like a branch breaking. I held my breath and listened. Another snap, closer. Could have been an animal. Deer moved through the woods all the time, and I had even seen the occasional elk or bear on previous trips. But something about the sound unsettled me. It wasn't just one or two steps. There was a rhythm to it, like someone moving carefully but steadily. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the wall of my tent. The light illuminated the thin fabric, casting a faint glow outside. I saw nothing. I sat there for a moment, debating whether to unzip the tent and check. But just as I moved to do it, the sound stopped. Nothing, just the wind again. I stayed awake for another hour, listening. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I got up, stretched, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. I walked around the campsite, checking for any tracks. The ground was covered in dry leaves, and I didn't see anything unusual. I pushed it to the back of my mind and went about my day. I spent the morning hiking a nearby trail and the afternoon gathering more firewood and filtering water from the creek. The feeling of unease had mostly faded by the time the sun started setting. That night, I built up my fire a little bigger than usual. It wasn't because I was scared. At least that's what I told myself. It was just a precaution. A fire kept animals away after all. I stayed up later than the night before, letting the flames die down to glowing embers before heading into my tent. I made sure my flashlight and knife were within reach before zipping myself inside my sleeping bag. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up again, but this time it wasn't the wind that woke me. It was the sound of breathing, slow, steady breathing, just outside my tent. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as I lay perfectly still, trying to convince myself that I was imagining it. But then I heard it again, closer. I forced myself to move, reaching slowly for my flashlight. My fingers wrapped around it and I clicked it on. The breathing stopped. I didn't move for what felt like an eternity. My eyes locked on the thin wall of my tent, waiting for a shadow to appear. But nothing happened. Finally, I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness. There was nothing there, but my fire, which had been completely out when I went to sleep, was now smoldering again, faint embers glowing in the pit. I hadn't touched it. I spent the rest of the night sitting up, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't sleep either. As soon as the sky started turning gray with the first light of dawn, I started packing up. I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Or maybe someone had been watching me. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing weekend in the woods. Just me, the sound of the wind through the trees, and a break from the constant noise of daily life. I had camped plenty of times before, mostly in established sites or with groups, but this time I wanted something more secluded. I wanted to be alone, deep in the forest, away from everything. I found a spot on a map that looked perfect, a small, remote clearing near a river, miles away from any major trail. It was marked as public land, open for dispersed camping. There wouldn't be any other campers around. No designated fire rings, no picnic tables, just me and the wilderness. I packed my gear carefully, double-checking everything. A sturdy tent, a warm sleeping bag, a lightweight stove, plenty of food and water, a first aid kit, a good knife, and my old but reliable flashlight. I brought extra batteries, too. I didn't take chances when it came to preparedness. My phone would be useless out there with no signal, but I had a GPS and a physical map just in case. The drive took longer than expected. I followed a narrow dirt road deep into the woods, the kind that hadn't seen maintenance in years. Potholes, loose gravel, overgrown branches scraping against the side of my truck. Eventually, I found a decent place to pull over and park, about a mile from my planned campsite. I loaded up my pack, locked the truck, and started hiking. The first part of the trail was easy, flat, well-worn from occasional hikers or hunters. But as I veered off onto the unmarked path toward the clearing, the terrain changed. The ground was uneven, thick with roots and fallen branches. I had to push through dense brush, thorns tugging at my sleeves. I was sweating by the time I reached the site. The clearing was smaller than I expected, but still a good spot. The river was close enough that I could hear the water moving over rocks. The trees formed a natural barrier around the space, making it feel hidden from the world. I set up my tent quickly, securing it with extra stakes in case the wind picked up. The sun was still high, so I gathered firewood while I had daylight, breaking up small branches and stacking them in a dry spot. By the time the sun dipped below the trees, I had a fire going. I cooked a simple meal, ate quickly, and sat back, listening to the forest. The quiet out there wasn't like the quiet at home. It was layered, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it. Just a vague unease like I was being watched. I shook it off as paranoia. I had been alone in the woods before. It was easy to let your mind play tricks on you when there was no one else around. I forced myself to relax, stretching out by the fire, letting the warmth sink into my bones. Then I heard it, a crunch in the distance. Slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. Could have been anything. An animal moving through the underbrush, a deer stepping carefully over fallen leaves. But it didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like a footstep, then another, and another. I turned off my flashlight. The fire cast long shadows, making it hard to see beyond the immediate glow. I strained my ears, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. I forced myself to move, to act normal, to pretend I wasn't unnerved. I banked the fire so it would last longer and climbed into my tent. Inside, it felt safer, even though I knew logically that a thin sheet of nylon wouldn't protect me from anything serious. I zipped up my sleeping bag and lay still, listening. The sounds of the forest carried on as usual. The river, the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. I started drifting off. Then something brushed against my tent. A light, deliberate touch, like fingers trailing along the fabric. My breath caught. I stayed completely still. Could have been the wind, could have been a branch, but I knew it wasn't. I reached for my flashlight, gripping it tightly. I counted to 3 in my head, then flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. I unzipped the tent slowly, peering out. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area. No movement. No sign of anything unusual. I stepped out, scanning the trees. My gut told me something was out there, just beyond the fire's reach. Watching. I stayed up for hours, sitting by the fire, straining my eyes into the darkness. Nothing else happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled back into my tent, leaving my flashlight in my hand. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the footprints. Not mine. Fresh prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. Large, booted, human. I packed up immediately. I didn't eat, didn't bother breaking down the fire properly. I just grabbed my gear and started hiking. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I didn't look back. When I got home, I checked the maps again, trying to reassure myself that the area was truly as isolated as I thought, that no one else should have been out there. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been out there with me that night, watching, and I would never know why.